Hi, welcome to One on Page. I am Scott. We're doing a countdown of Stephen King short stories, 115 in total, all of his published and completed short stories. We are on stories 35 to 31. Let's go ahead and get started. Short story number 35 is in Nightmares and Dreamscapes. It is Suffer the Little Children, originally published in 1972 in Cavalier magazine. Of course, one of King's favorite magazines to publish in the early 70s. I won't necessarily say favorite, but one of his most frequent. I've seen at least 3 short stories, I think, in the last couple of videos that have been published in Cavalier in that year. Uh, it is about a teacher, Emily Sidley. She's a third grade teacher, and she basically gets wigged out by her students, and she has probably a mental breakdown. She has a mental breakdown essentially, and after having a leave of absence, she comes back and her breakdown continues, and she ends up murdering some students. uh, and she ends up in a mental home. And I have a feeling of nostalgia for this. And I didn't know why, because it just didn't stick out to me for any other reason. But this year I started reading uh, 2 books, Bradbury Stories and 100 Short Stories, Ray Bradbury. 2 collections that have 100 stories of Ray Bradbury in each one of them, uh, different stories in each collection. So I'm not all the way through those stories yet. There's 200 stories. I think I've read like 70 total so far. But there's actually, and I can't think of the story right now, but there's actually a story very similar to this one. And there are multiple stories about adults basically being driven nuts by children. Several Bradbury stories are like that. And so the writing style in Suffer the Little Children is reminiscent of that. And of course, the topic is reminiscent either. And so I talked a couple of videos ago about On Slide Road, how basically it's an homage to Flannery O'Connor's A Good Man is Hard to Find. And this is essentially an homage to Ray Bradbury's several stories. Uh, and I just think King does an homage to Bradbury a little bit better than he does to Flannery O'Connor. And it still stands somewhat on its own, whereas on Slide In Road, I don't think it stood on its own. It's just like, oh, that's just a facade of A Good Man is Hard to Find. It also kind of probably helps that I've read lots of King that was somewhat like this before I read Bradbury. When I read Bradbury when I was a kid, it was like the science fiction or Bradbury's version of science fiction. And so I didn't have the more horror element of Ray Bradbury that I do in these short stories. I did read, I believe it was The October Country, when I was in junior high, but the majority of my Bradbury reading has been when I've been an adult. Short story number 34 is in Skeleton Crew. It is Here There Be Tigers. Uh, Speaking of Bradbury, there's also a Bradbury story entitled Here There Be Tigers, also with a Y in tigers instead of an I. Although I have read that short story, I don't think that the similarities between the two are that much, but I could be wrong. It's been a while since I've read that story, or it's been many Bradbury stories ago. It was originally published in 1968 in Ubris magazine, which I believe was his college magazine, because he wrote possibly in the afterward to Skeleton Crew that it was his thinking that that was just a funny way of writing hubris. Basically, a kid goes, "Yo, teach, I need to go to the bathroom." Goes to the bathroom. There's a tiger in the bathroom. Like, I really, really, really gotta pee. Goes back. Another kid goes in and tells that kid, "Hey man, there's a tiger in there." And the other kid's like, "Whatever." And he goes in. That kid, but he doesn't hear anything. But he goes in, sees a torn shirt. He relieves himself in the sink. The teacher finds him doing that, which you could tell this is a story written in the 60s. You imagine a teacher of the opposite sex going into a restroom nowadays, man. uh, but he tries to tell her. She doesn't listen. She goes around the corner, and he goes back to class. And we are to assume, of course, that the tiger ate the teacher. But we don't know. It's just you could think that there's a deeper meaning to the story, but to me, it kind of feels almost like if it had been written as an EC comic story too, I could see that just as well. It's a fun read, and I read it without really thinking, "Yo, there's a way deeper meaning to this." Short story number 33 is in Skeleton Crew. It is The Raft. It was originally published in Gallery in 1982. I believe, I haven't looked it up, I believe King wrote in Skeleton Crew that he had actually written the story before, but had lost it somewhere along the way, and basically he rewrote it. And if you've seen Creepshow 2, I think, either Creepshow 2 or Cat's Eye, there's a version of the story too. Basically, four kids in the summer swim out to a raft. Oh, four kids. It's like late October. They swim out to a raft. It's dark. Nobody's around. They're. I think they're like college kids, and they're just, two guys, two girl. One of the guys is like super jock guy and got his nerdy best friend, and then there's just this big oil spot on the river, and it seems to be moving, and then it eats one of them essentially, and then it's like, okay, they want to get off the raft and get back, but they do, oil's going to eat them. Another story where it's not, uh, you could go through it and find deeper symbolism. It's like, okay, uh, it was published in 1982, but you have the late 70s oil crisis back then. It could be some deeper meaning there, I guess. Uh, but it also could be like, four horny teenagers, and you know what happens to horny teenagers when they're trying to get sex? They're gonna get killed. It's just, it wasn't like a machete wielding madman. It was oil. Still a fun read. That's despite some not particularly depthful characters. Uh, I mean, you basically have the jock, the nerd, and two, for lack of a better term, bimbos. I wouldn't necessarily call it myself, but that's kind of how they're presented there. But still, as far as like the terror element, you kind of get that with it. Short story number 32 is in Night Shift. Sorry, I don't have a cover for it. It is I Am the Doorway, published in Cavalier Magazine originally in 1971 this time. If you've seen some covers of Night Shift, you see the one with the hand, it's got some bandages on it, but it's got eyes on the fingers also. That's from this story. Basically, a guy went to space, ran into alien mutation, and now he's got like eyes on his hands and kind of force him to kill. These eyes are allowing that alien world to see into our world. Uh, and so he, not wanting to, but he strikes out. And then it's like, what does he do after that? This is kind of quintessential early King, short, hard edge, focused on a single character. Uh, and in some ways, he progresses after that. In some ways, not so much. You're not going to find this type of short story, him writing 20, 30, 40 years later, but is a pretty good example of what he had to offer at that point. Short story number 31 is in Just After Sunset. It is The Things They Left Behind, which is, of course, a little bit reminiscent of Tim O'Brien's The Things They Carried. If you read that, reflecting on Vietnam soldiers. This one is kind of a time frame of America after 9/11. Originally published in Transgressions, Volume 2. But basically, it's about a guy who has survivor's guilt because he was supposed to be at the towers. He took the day off that day, and he's got survivor's guilt, and he starts finding things that belong to people who did die then. And I'll be quite honest, there's a bit of schmaltz to this, uh, but I think it's written well. And I think anybody who has any type of survivor's guilt can understand it. And I will say I'm the type of person who I watch Hallmark Christmas movies. I don't mind emotional manipulation unless it's really blatant. As I've said before, if you can feel uh, the marionette strings pulling, that's when I don't like it. But if you're just like, how'd that happen? I'm fine with that. I go into stories to be emotionally manipulated. I want to feel. And it does do that. Now, it doesn't have the same depth as some of King's better stories. I think what I feel is his number one story, which I will talk about, 29 stories from now, 30 stories from now, 29 stories from now. That one is also emotional manipulation. I just don't think it's in quite the same way, and there's a more subtlety to it than this one, but this still is very good. So we are now up to short story number 30, 30 through 26 that we'll do next time. This is pretty much prime King as far as short stories go. We've gone past the Drac, we've gone past the Man with a Belly, and the other horrible, horrible stories that are back there, and we're into the good stuff. Everything that I'm going to talk about from here on out, everything that I talked about the last couple of videos is good. I may have things to point out that isn't great about them necessarily, but all these stories are good. So that is it. Please like and subscribe, leave a comment, and I will talk to you next time.